Celebrating 30 years of broadcast excellence. The Evening Rush on 1290 WMCS, the talk of the town.
Welcome back, Milwaukee. 442. It is Monday with Meade and the internationally known Frederick Alexander Meade. Columnist is known all over the world in red, and it is so good to have him on. But we were talking before break, again, about the prison industrial complex and how all of this happens. Brother Meade, you were saying before we had to go to break.
The prison industrial complex, in order to understand it, you have to put it within the context or frame it within the context of the history of the African American. When we were brought here for one reason, and that was to serve the interests of white Americans as slaves. That was the only reason we were brought here. Well, that worked for more than 2 centuries. But at some point, about 150 years ago, the enslaved people were freed. We were freed, and that created a massive problem that this country has had to tangle with ever since. And that problem is, what do you do with this population of blacks who we only brought here to enslave but can no longer enslave? What do we do with this population? And they call that the white man's burden. That was known as the white man's burden. And to this day, white America still largely regards us as a burden because we were never here for any other purpose but to work as slaves. So what does that mean? Well, what do you do with this population? Well, if you're a mild-mannered, rather educated, rather skilled person, black person, who does not advocate for social justice, who bows at the altar of white supremacy, there has always been a place for you in this country most of the time. Most of the time there's been a place for those people who simply kneel at the altar of white supremacy and do not stand up for their people. Those are your Clarence Thomases, your Condoleezza Rice, etc. But if you have less skills, if you are less educated, and you advocate for social justice and challenging white supremacy, then there's 2 places this country has had for you, and that's the graveyard and prison. Well, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, and the million black people in prison at this moment all bear witness to that fact. Now you say, okay, I understand why Malcolm X was imprisoned and why he was murdered, and Martin Luther King and Fred Hampton. I understand them, but what about those million black folk in prison? We make up about 13% of this population, but we make up almost half of the people incarcerated in this country. That's an enormous statistic. So you say, well, what about those million? They weren't necessarily fighting justice. Why are they in there? They've done something wrong. Well, yes, that's true. But in order to understand criminal behavior, you have to understand the forces that cause it to exist. Criminal behavior is not a function of a personality or DNA or genetics. Criminal behavior is largely a function of poverty, social forces, disenfranchisement. When you emerge from a population that emerges from poor schools, poverty, you've been disenfranchised, you couldn't vote, you weren't permitted to read, the cops come down, beat you, and there's no justice. You've been denied opportunities ever since you've come into this country, to the extent that even in the face of a black president, black people are still mistreated, even he is. So when you emerge from a population that has the history of being oppressed, disenfranchised in every way conceivable, you are more likely to engage in criminal behavior as a mode of survival. Now, what happens? So we're freed, we're disenfranchised, the prisons start to fill up, the jailhouses start to fill up, state penitentiaries start to fill up, and we make it all the way to the Reagan years, and these prisons start to overflow. Well, that causes the emergence of private prison institutions. Private businesses say, look, you have this problem. These prisons are filling up. You don't have anywhere to put them. We can erect prisons. We will take these people off your hands, and we can do it for cheaper. Well, when that occurred, that essentially began the prison industrial complex. What happened was these private institutions started to erect these prisons in these rural towns, these places in the middle of nowhere. Well, what did that do for those local economies? Those rural areas, all of a sudden, this prison is employing 20 to 30% of its population. This prison is giving jobs to people who otherwise would not work. Money is being generated in these small little towns. These people are working. They can pay their bills. Well, when you have money, you pay your bills. You can buy goods and services. So the local businesses are doing well. The economy in these areas are stimulated. So that's good for the political class. The politicians say, wow, this is good. Look how much money it's brought to my town. People are working. People are happy. Let's keep this thing going. But at whose expense? It falls on the back of the black masses. For we make up almost 50% of the prison population and represent only 13% of the total population. Now, it's not only the business class that has pulled this trick on black people, it's the legal system. Many judges have under-the-table deals with these prison houses to supply them bodies. These prison systems cannot function. These jail houses cannot function without bodies. So you have judges who steer black and even Latino and even in some instances white people, white inmates or white defendants to these prisons, to the extent that in Pennsylvania we had 2 judges 2 years ago that pleaded guilty to steering young youth to detention centers owned privately, and they were paid $2.6 million to do it. Now, they were caught, but this is a problem that's widespread throughout the nation. So if you're a black man, you go into one of these courthouses, you don't understand that the fix is in. You have a public defender who's right out of law school and doesn't understand the law anyway. He just met you that day, hasn't even looked over your case. He provides, weak advocacy for you and doesn't understand the law anyway. Well, you're found guilty, and now you're in the judge's clutches because he controls the sentencing. These judges, you're black anyway, so they had no regard for you anyway. But these judges, many of whom have these deals with these prisons, these private prisons, simply direct you their way. And not only that, they don't only direct you that way, they extend your time. They get paid per person. They need bodies in these prisons for as long as possible. So these judges oftentimes direct people to these prisons where you may have gotten a 2-year sentence for a minor crime, but now they've made it 4.
Brother Meade,
yes, sir.
Do you know why that's everything that you're saying can be proven? Here in our state, at the same time that this prison industrial complex started growing, the legislature came up with truth in sentencing, 3 strikes, you're out, and no parole.
That's right. It's interesting you say that, and mandatory minimum.
Yeah.
Well, how did that happen? These private prisons have lobbyists on Capitol Hill.
Yep.
They lobby the senators, the congresspeople, and even the president. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, I will tell you who was instrumental in pushing forward the interests of the prison industrial complex. Our first black president, Bill Clinton.
Yes.
He was instrumental in pushing their agenda forward, and he did it through what is called the Omnibus Crime Bill. The Omnibus Crime Bill was a piece of legislation that he crafted. He created this legislation whereby a number of new crimes were added to the National Crime Ledger, and these are crimes that are punishable by way of imprisonment. He added a number of crimes to the National Crime Ledger whereby you could be sent to jail overnight. When this legislation passed, overnight, black men were being locked up left and right because many of them had to do with gun charges.
Habitual criminality.
I'm sorry?
Habitual criminality.
Absolutely. Well, a disenfranchised population is more likely to engage in crime than one that is not. Truth be told, the individual who gives way to crime has really given up hope. No child grows up and says, I want to be a criminal. They don't necessarily do that. Now, we have this new thing, gangster rap, that encourages our youth to go that way. But generally, a black young man growing up has no aspiration of being a criminal.
Hey, Frederick.
It is only when he gives up hope that he engages in this kind of
Frederick,
behavior.
we're going to take this call.